Hello BattleTech fans, this is Travis, back with another episode of what I hope to be kind of a new and fun ongoing series of building custom cards for the old BattleTech customizable card game, or trading card game as it was originally called. But if you didn't catch my first episode where we sat down and we built a Falconer, that was a much longer video, a lot more in-depth about each of the processes, but this will be a little kind of ongoing experiment here. But today I've found some really awesome art that I want to use, because that is always kind of number one for me for building a new custom card. So let's kind of sit back and I'll show you what I found, and we'll dive into making a new card for the card game. All right, so this illustration by Spooky on DeviantArt is definitely something I've kind of had in mind for a while, but I actually didn't even know what this mech was. For me, kind of my gaming is limited to the 3025, 3050 era, just because that covers the range of the novels that I've read, and the novels really kind of inspires kind of my desire to kind of game in this universe. But it's an amazing piece of art, and I definitely wanted to kind of go back and find it. So I did a little bit of research to figure out what it was. Usually in these DeviantArt pages, sometimes in the description, it'll say what the mech is, but it didn't here. But fortunately, it did have a link to Spooky's Patreon. And so I went over and hopped onto that because I didn't even know he had one. And I went ahead and kind of subscribed to give a couple bucks months toward that. Certainly, I would love, if you guys are enjoying this, to subscribe to my Patreon. That's Renegade HPG. But for all those other artists out there, if people that are enjoying their art really just throwing a couple bucks their way, it really makes a difference. So I'm happy to do that for the illustrators that I often use and kind of help make my gaming experience more fun. But fortunately, once I subscribed, I got access to that special Patreon content, and this illustration was in there. And in the description on Patreon, it does have the name of the mech. All right, so we have the Nightstar here. And so what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to hop on over to Sarna, and we're going to pull up the entry for that. And we're going to refer to that a lot more later, but the key thing we want to know now is what model we're going to be using. So that NSR-9J is going to be the main model for this. And let's go ahead and pull up the master unit list, because this is going to give us a little bit of information as well. And we'll pull up that 9J. And so this is going to tell us what eras it's going to be suitable for. And so I have mechs that are for all the different eras. You know, mainly I've been in the 3025 and Clan Invasion era. And so those are the ones I'm trying to kind of build for the most. So I have a couple cool arts that I found that were for either for the Jeehun or the Civil War, or even kind of the Star League era, or I call it the American Civil War, or the coup era. And so that's just kind of planning ahead in my mind for expansions that will never exist. But for here, let's kind of look where it is for 3025. And so it looks like this is just a Comstar mech. And then the Clan Invasion, okay, looks like it expanded out for the Clan Invasion. So I think we're going to probably use this model in the Clan Invasion era. So we're going to say Comstar, and then Steiner and Davian. And let's skip on over to the Photoshop where all this building happens. All right, so I pulled up the card that we made in the first episode. We worked on the Falconer, and I picked this one to kind of use as the template because it has the Davian Steiner Comstar also by coincidence. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of start to edit this, and so I will cut ahead for you guys so you don't have to kind of follow while I type. All right, we got the name there, and then the next kind of most important for these, all right, because I'm designing these for cool art. They've got to look cool. That's number one. So let's make sure we give that illustrator some credit. So Spooky is FLORIAN MELLIES, I think is how you pronounce it. If someone knows, just correct me. All right, so we got that plugged in. We got to make sure we're giving credit where credit's due. Let's go ahead and plug in this armament. All right, so we got the main armament set out. So we got one ERPPC, 2 medium lasers, 2 Gauss rifle, and 1 small laser. Now, I will sometimes put in ER large laser, ER medium laser, but generally I don't differentiate between pulse or heavy or all that other stuff. And that's just more for space. That's just kind of the way I've decided to kind of go along with it. But the next thing we need to do is we need to update that speed. So the Nightstar is going to be a slow mech, as most 95 tonners are. And then let's find out a little bit more about this mech. All right, so the next program we're going to dive into is going to be the Solaris Skunkworks. All right, so I've got the Nightstar pulled up here, and we can check out a few stats. You know, confirmed. All right, we're 3.5, so that's going to be a slow mech. That 14 double heat sink is going to be important, so it's got a 28 for its basic heat mitigation. Let's check out the armor. 18.5. Okay, this is a big boy. All right, so this is going to be kind of maxed out armor up around kind of that direwolf area. So probably a 411 is what I'll guess out of that. Equipment, we have all the lasers. It doesn't look like there's any special equipment there that we need to take a case for, and checking, and there's no case, which makes sense because it's just Gauss rifle ammunition, which isn't going to explode. All right, so we have the basics of the information we need here. So from here, we're gonna go over to my Excel sheet where I kind of take some basic notes about each of these mechs. All right, so we've made some space. So this is a spreadsheet that I use, and I just kind of take notes about the builds as I go. It's nothing fancy. It just kind of helps me keep track and go back if I need to make an adjustment for my own formulas of how I do things. It's easy to kind of go back and figure out what needs adjustment. We're looking at a 411 here. So one way that I check that is I look at how I'm determining how much armor it is I look at the center torso armor, and depending on how many direct PPC hits that it can take before going internal, that's usually what I determine for that number. All right, so whether it's 1, 2, 3, or 4. All right, so if take a PPC hit and it goes right to the internal, then you're either 0, or maybe if you're right on threshold, you might be 1. But then beyond that, the center torso armor for the Night Sky was 50, so that will definitely be a 4. And then the 11, I look at all the other mechs that I've kind of built. Looks like the Alice down here is 10 and 19, which is out of 411. And then I think the 410 that I have, the King Crab, oh, here we go. Yeah, so the King Crab was a 410, and he is at 10 and 17. So a little bit less armor. So he's right in between the Alice and King Crab. So we're gonna go ahead and err on the 411 side. And then we decided that he had 28 heat mitigation, so I'm going to plug that in there. And then we need to figure out what weapons he had. So we had 1 ER PPC, 2 Gauss rifles, 2 MPL medium pulse lasers, and then 1 small laser. And then once I figure out if any of those are going to push him past that heat mitigation, I'll put that in the second column for what I use for his overheat weapons. And then if he has any AP weapons, interpersonnel weapons, or any Alpha Strike weapons, we'll put them in a different column as well. But first, let's go back to Solaris Skunk Works. All right, and let's look at these equipment. All right, so we got the ERPPC, and we're just using this to figure out how much heat is generated by each. And so let's say let's start with the big ones. All right, so fire the big ones first. So he's got the ERPPC, that's 15 heat. The Gauss is 1 each, so we're up to 17. The medium pulse is 4 each, so that's 8. That brings up 25 if he fires both of those. The small laser really is only a tiebreaker, if anything, or maybe I'll use it in what I call a close quarters combat modifier, which I generally only give to a mech that they can access if they're fighting 2 or more mechs. And generally I reserve that category for their rear facing weapons. So a lot of mechs will have things like medium lasers in the rear. I'll put that damage into a close quarter combat, assuming that you would want to be skirmishing with more than one mech before somebody's going to be able to outflank you and get behind you at all. All right, so that's my justification for that ability that I put on some of my mechs. But it looks like this guy can fire everything without worrying about overheat. All right, so so let's go back, or actually real quick, we'll figure out where the damage is. And so we got 10, the Gauss rifles are 15 each, so we're up to 40, and then the medium pulse are 6 each. So we're at 52 damage coming out of that primary weapon strike. Granted that the medium pulse lasers are kind of really short range, and so I might actually throw that into a close quarter combat situation, but we'll see if we want to do that. It's a possibility. I sometimes throw that in for weapons that are just super short range, assuming that you're usually not going to be in that super short range as often as you're going to be in the range for your bigger, longer range weapons. So something to think about. All right, so we're plugging all this in. So we're dishing out 52, and we were at 25, I believe, for the heat. So we can run with that mech, fire everything, and be just fine. I have a feeling it might have been 26, but it doesn't matter. It definitely wasn't going over its threshold. For the attack, basically I'm giving a point of attack for every 7 points of damage, and so this is going to be a 7 attack. Now the original game used kind of a sliding scale formula where weapons with longer range got more points than weapons with shorter range. I've kind of stayed away from that. I don't think, from my experience in the tabletop game, it's very rare that you're able to control the situation enough so that you can just stay in long range while other mechs are out of the range and just kind of keep peppering on them for more than a turn or so, if you even get a turn. And so I don't think it's worth sliding scale and saying the entire combat, those longer range weapons are going to get more damage output. So so it's just a kind of a design decision that I made to get rid of that sliding scale. And then if, like I said, if there are weapons that are just super short, then we will put those into possibly add ability in there. A mech like the Burk, where I said the Burk can't assign damage to mechs that are the same speed or that are faster speed, unless those mechs target the Burk. So I'll just kind of tweak it in little ways there to make it kind of ring true with the tabletop, with the theme. All right, so I want to keep things thematic. The original CCG game wasn't too concerned with the thematic, but I am, because these are my fun home cards to make, and that's my justification for that. So we don't have to worry about any kind of overheat. The small laser we didn't really put into account. If we end up doing that close quarter combat, maybe we can kind of bring that in as a tiebreaker. But we're at 7, so let's hop back over to Photoshop. And I totally missed this already when the first time we were here, but let's get rid of this old art and let's go back and put our new art in there. All right, we got that taken care of. All right, now let's update our little boxes. So primary attack was a 7. We got that speed down to the 2, which is where it's supposed to be. Let's get our armor, all right, is in there and set, and now let's start worrying about kind of what's going on down here. So our mech doesn't have an overheat, all right, so we can get rid of that, but it is going to have long range, all right. So the long range, what I do for long range is basically any weapon whose range is greater than 21, all right, 21 being the maximum range for the old inner sphere weapons. If it can hit outside of that range, then I give it that long range ability. And so for each of the weapons, so it's got 1 ERPPC and 2 Gauss rifles, and so that is going to push us into a 3 for long range. Assuming I'm correct in that ERPPC's range, yep, ERPPC's max range is 23, and so let's do that. And one idea I have that I'd love to hear you guys input in the comments, but for changing what long range does in the game, and this will be kind of add a little bit of complication to it perhaps, but basically instead of saying that you can use that long range to put that damage into the target, adding long range, or maybe you can do this as an and or, of saying that creating like a second layer of damage assignment in your battle, so that there's basically an initial battle phase where any mechs with long range can target the mechs without long range and basically assign that damage, and that kind of simulates that idea that they can be kind of doing that hard hitting. So instead of what we talked about before with those long range weapons getting proportionally greater value, of if you put it into that long range and you say, well, this mech can engage beyond the weapons range of its opponents and it can apply that damage first. So you could come in and see, you know, something like, you know, a wasp or a locust hanging around, and if it wants to engage something like a Nightstar, you have the second layer of combat where the Nightstar can apply its long range damage. It can tap 3 damage into those mechs before they even get a chance to assign their damage and basically destroy them and wipe them out, which is kind of reminiscent of what could happen in the tabletop and what those long range weapons are really going to kind of bring value to in the battle. And then anything that survived that long range would go into that normal combat. So if it's just, you know, 2 heavy mechs kind of fighting each other, you know, and that 3 damage doesn't do anything, then it's not going to have an effect. But it will be able to kind of, maybe you can combine a lot of weapons with long range and come into a mech and maybe take out a mech from the enemy with all your long range capability before they were able to engage an attack. Interesting mechanic, might be fun to kind of play with, you know, play a little home rule, you know, see how it plays out in the game, but something to try. But let's go ahead and update all this, and so let's get rid of that jump. We were talking about kind of that close quarter combat, maybe bumping the medium pulse laser into that. I'm not going to do that right now. If I did that, I would call it the CQC ability, and it would have 2, all right, because the medium pulse lasers were 6 each plus the small laser. I would add into that just to kind of make sure it gets up to that 14 threshold, which is what it would need for 2. And then you would take that 2 off of its primary attack, all right? And so those weapons aren't being used to kind of contribute that 7. And so that can maybe be 2 versions I would play with, and maybe as I kind of go along with the rest of this video, I'll kind of start to favor one of those over the other. But we got that long range in there, and now we want to do the flavor text. So for that, we're going to hop back over to Sarna. All right, so we pulled up the entry. So what I do here is I just look at kind of what people have put for that Sarna, for that flavor. Maybe later I'll kind of, if I'm not getting much out of Sarna, I'll pick up the TRO that it came with and kind of read that, see if I can get a little bit more. But generally I'll just read through here, figure out kind of what kind of captures my attention. So it starts out kind of talking about the Nightstar and the Civil War, and then that it's basically ceased production. So that might be flavor text I would actually kind of use more for Mech in the 3025 era. But if we read on here, it talks a little bit about the Nightstar coming back into production. And obviously this mech that we're using is back in production because it's being used by Steiner and Davian. So that's kind of the text that I'm going to kind of lean toward for the flavor text. So let's skip back on over to Paint Shop, or rather Photoshop is what I meant to say. And we're going to go ahead and delete this, and I will kind of cut forward to when I kind of plug it in so you guys don't have to watch me typing. All right, so this is what I came up with. All right, so we have first emerging in 2767 during the Ameris Civil War. Production of the Nightstar ended in the first year of the First Succession War. That production was renewed about 250 years later by factories within both halves of the Federated Commonwealth. So what I like to do with this fluff text is just kind of add little teasers to the rest of the lore and other little stories. So if someone's reading this, they're going to be like, oh, what's the Ameris Civil War? What's the First Succession War? Why would it end production? You know, why would it come back in with the Federated Commonwealth? It just kind of like is a little bit of fun, just kind of thinking about what a new player would think about if they're picking up this card and reading it, and what it would kind of do to spark their imagination. So that's my thought there. But we've got most of this kind of figured out already. It looks like somehow the speed got kicked back to medium. So let's get back that down to slow. And then the final step for this is going to be the costing. All right, so the costing is a little tricky. For that, we're gonna hop on over to a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet that Michael Cohen produced, which is just an amazing little document that goes into extreme detail, having reverse engineered the costing formulas for the original game. I use this kind of as a guide, and I have just kind of plugged in, kind of while you guys weren't looking, all the different values. And so we got 4, 11, long range of 3, and that brings us out to 10.6 value. All right, and so I generally don't like to have any mechs that are breaking over 10. All right, I like to try to max it out at 9. And I'm wondering real quick, if we did plug that 2 damage into close quarter combat, what it would do. I value close quarter combat very similar to Alpha Strike in terms of how often you're probably going to be able to use it. So let's just kind of move those numbers around and see how it affects the cost of this mech. All right, so that brings it down to 9. All right, so that's where I want to be with this mech. All right, so we'll keep that in mind as we kind of go forward in terms of deciding what we're going to do to finally cost this mech. All right, so I've got that 9 plugged in here. We have the A and M buyouts. For the M, this happens to already be set at 1. And so I do basically 1 type of munition, 1 M for every type of munition that the mech is going to use. So this has Gauss rifle ammunition, so it's going to be 1 M. And then the A becomes pretty superfluous after you get past 3-4 cost mechs, because by that time you're going to have A out on the board, so you can mostly ignore that. It's just kind of for funsies. So it's a big mech, we'll say 3. And so what I'd like to do with these extra costs, 1, L is generally reserved for really big mechs, and P is kind of a special circumstance. I usually just bring that in if the lore talks something about this mech taking a little bit of extra kind of string pulling or bureaucracy to get it out onto the battlefield. As a mech that just got emerged in the Federated Commonwealth, you can maybe justify adding a little bit of P in there. And one thing that I will do with P, basically anytime I'm adding a buyout past the 3rd buyout, I'm assuming that people people are not going to want to play with 4 in their deck. All right, so essentially by adding in that P, I'm doing one of two things. One, you're going to have to pay that anyway, all right, if you're playing a competitive deck, because you're not going to have 4 different kinds of resources. Or the alternative is I'm forcing you to use a different card and possibly a different deployment in order to cover that cost. So things like Trial of Grievance or Comstar Support, you could use that to cover the P, but essentially you're paying another card in your deck and a deployment in order to cover that extra cost to bring the base cost down. All right, and so obviously that's an idea that would take a lot of playtesting to figure out if it makes sense, if it's viable. But in my head, just for these fun cards, which I'm mostly just looking at and not really playing that much, that's kind of how I justify bringing it down. So if we kept that long range and we kept that 7 base attack, I would probably say keep this at the 3A1M 2L and maybe that 2P, or even drop that 2P and let that 2L be the one that kind of justifies the bringing down of the base cost. So let's go with that for now. And so we have, that's our mech cost, all right? So 3, 1, and then 2 for their buyouts. And then if we did decide to go in and put in the close quarter combat, so if we went with this version here, 2 close quarter combat and then 5 as a base attack instead of that 7, that would definitely justify bringing that cost down, in which case I would probably bring this to an 8 with possibly no L, or maybe even a 7 with 1 or 2 L. Again, that goes to playtesting and figuring out and thinking about it a little bit more than I want to kind of have you guys sitting here watching me. But those are the various options of what we could do for this mech, and that kind of concludes the build for the Nightstar 9J. One thing that I do want to kind of throw out there as kind of an idea is a thought that I have on big mechs. And big mechs were a big issue in the original game, and the big issue in the sense that they were just not playable. Once you really got past that 7 or 8, you're not going to be seeing more expensive mechs, much less the Daishis and the Direwolves that are way up there in the teens. And I think that is an actual error in how things are costed in the game, all right? And that comes down to that formula, and what Michael's spreadsheet that I just showed you kind of uses and reverse engineers that, is that formula is linear, all right? So basically that formula, what it does is that all the different abilities have a different value that are assigned to them. And as you add those abilities to the mech, you're increasing the cost of that mech. And now what Michael, if you listen to some of my other podcasts on this where we're talking about the trading card game, Michael will talk about what's called the original sin, all right, with the costing, all right. The original sin being that in the costing formula, the first 5 attributes of each mech are free, all right. So a 2 cost mech has 7 attributes, all right, and a 4 cost mech has 9 attributes. And now you can take that and you can look at it and say, well, that's going to create a problem right away. And this problem is what led to the abundance of cheap, faster mechs in the original game. So if you have 2 cost mechs that were giving you 7 points of value, that's 14 points of value you're getting for those 4 resources. But if you buy a single mech that's 4 resources, that's 4 plus 5, you're getting 9 points of value from that mech if you went for a single 4, all right? So right there, by doing 1 4 cost instead of 2 cost, you're getting 9 points of value instead of 14 points of value. And that is just gonna multiply as you get higher. So if you have a 10 cost mech, you're getting 15 points worth of value. Well, then if you deploy 5 2 cost mechs that are giving you 7 points each, that's 35. So all of a sudden, who's gonna play a mech that has 15 points worth of value when you could be playing 35 points of value of those small cheap mechs, all right? And that's where the game breaks down, and that's why we don't see a lot of these awesome mechs, these big mechs, the Timberwolves, the Direwolves, all these big fun mechs in the base game. And so how do you fix that? Well, what I say is that as you get higher, one, you need to somehow adjust your formula to account for that fact of those 5 free points, all right? I don't have kind of the math ability to necessarily address that. Maybe somebody listening is interested in this little project that I'm suggesting, but there's not only do you need to kind of account for those 5 points as you're getting higher in your mech value, but the way you need to do that is there's a cost that people have not accounted for into that cost formula, and that is opportunity cost, all right? The opportunity cost of investing multiple turns to pay for a mech and waiting to get to build a mech to later the game where you have more resources on the board versus the smaller mechs. All right, and opportunity cost is a real thing. All right, and somebody with good math skills, maybe that's listening to this, can kind of dive in and figure out what is that opportunity cost and what is the formula to scale and to calculate that opportunity cost into the formula for these mechs as you get into bigger and bigger units with more abilities on that individual unit, but then a higher deploy cost, more time, more resources that you're going to have to take to put into it. All right, and for that reason, I simply do not care if the costing formula is telling me kind of these bigger mechs need to be more expensive. Generally, once I start to get to those more expensive mechs, I start to ignore what the formula is telling me a little bit more, and I start to either fudge it a little bit by just deciding that I'm going to lower the cost, or by adding various buyouts to kind of cheapen it so that you have to be doing other things like getting logistics in your deck, or getting politics in your deck, or getting tactics out there to justify getting these mechs out and paying them. So, but that's a little something to chew on. It just happened to be a subject kind of applied as this mech happened to be a 95-ton Nightstar. But I think it's important. And I think if people, for their home rules, and I think for the evolution of game for people that are making custom card sets out there, if they want to kind of make those a little bit more fun, then you need to account for that opportunity cost, and you need to some way adjust your formula to allow those bigger mechs to get out there without basically making bad tactical decisions, without putting out a 10 cost mech when anybody in the right mind should put out a 5 2 cost mechs instead, or even 2 5 cost mechs. So that wouldn't be as good then as the 5 2 cost mechs. But that's it. Join the Facebook group BattleTech TCG if you haven't already. Let them know you're there. They can give you lots of information about how you can get cards on the cheap or play online on Lacquer Tabletop Simulator. But without further ado, this is Travis signing off. Definitely check out the sponsors that are about to pop up here. There's some pretty cool things, pretty good places to buy your BattleTech, and one amazing artist that you can check out and maybe buy some prints for yourself. But that's it. We'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.